On the Jacob Buehrer Show today, I am so happy to have on Little Al. As you all know, you've raced, wow, all over this world. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having us on. And little Al means I'm young. Okay. So I love it.
For sure. So to kind of get started, you come from a family of racers. You yourself you've won two Indy 500s. 1994, you were unstoppable on the track. Racing was a lot different back then. I guess you could say that there was more families back then racing, kind of like that. But back then, it was a lot different. The sport was. It was a lot more dangerous. So, how did you kind of grow into loving racing? Was it because of your family background, or did you kind of grow into loving racing because you heard that engine and you said, I could do this 24/7, 365?
Well, hey, of course it's being born where I was born for sure. Okay. My family had great success at the Indy 500 and all that kind of stuff. And so it was natural for me to go that direction. But it took, I loved racing. I loved everything about racing. And so I started racing go-karts when I was 9 years old and instantly loved it and enjoyed it. And so, it took, in order for me to reach the levels that I did, I had to love what I was doing, and so simply put, the family does not drive the race car. Okay. I had to get in it and I had to drive it and I had to, have the desire to go and win at all costs. And so that's what we did. I was blessed with the talent to go and drive these cars and we became successful at it.
For sure, 110%. Um, so what would you say it was like the first time you were racing in the series? I guess we would say Indy 500, when you really made it. What was that feeling like? Of course you saw your dad and other family members over the years race, but what is it like your own self? You're your own self at the end of the day. Um, what is that feeling like? Just getting in the race car, kind of describe what that feeling is like the first time you're in that big race.
Yeah, for me it was just dream come true. Okay. I had been dreaming about racing in the Indy 500 since I was like 8 years old. Okay. And watching my dad win his first Indy 500 in 1970. And so I just dreamed about doing it. And so that very first year was 1983, was my first year at Indy. And just driving out on the track in an Indy car was a dream come true. And then qualifying for the race was another dream come true. And then going and being on the grid and doing the parade laps for the 500 race itself was another dream come true. So that first year, all of my dreams came true, except for the one dream of winning the Indy 500. And so, that came 10 years later. It took that long for me to win the 500. And so, yeah, it was just, it was magnificent. It's hard to put into words what that, what the feelings were. They were just, honest to God, lifelong childhood dreams come true.
Fascinating. And what would you say? This is a question from a viewer. Um, what was it like? It was so much more dangerous back then, of course. Do you think it's kind of made the sport less entertaining to a point today, with how cars are a lot more safer? You have a lot more younger people driving nowadays, which some people would say is fantastic, but some people would say, oh, if they can do it at the age of 22, could I do it? Compared to where it took you, and a lot of people back then, AJ Foyt, so many others, a while to work your way up there. What are your thoughts on that with it being safer today? What are your overall thoughts?
Yeah, I just think it's great. Okay, so when you go back into my era of racing, which was the 80s and 90s, we were so much safer at that point than they were in the 50s and 60s. Okay. And so it's just a progression. Okay. And so, yes, today's racing is safer. Thank God. Okay. That the cars are safer and they're more reliable and all that kind of thing. And so, the only thing that changes is your strategy. It changes the way that you attack the race, the way that you actually the races unfold is just a different formula than it was in the 80s and 90s. And in the 80s and 90s, the way the races unfold were totally different from the way it was in the 60s and 70s. Okay, so it's still hard to win. It's still hard to go out there and be competitive. I don't think really the age is a little bit different, okay, but I wouldn't say it's so much younger because my first Indy 500 I was 21 years old, and so now today they've lowered that age where in the 80s you had to be 21 in order to race in the Indy 500. Okay, today that age is 18. So that's the only differences, I mean, it's still a young man's sport all the way around, and so I think today's racing is just as competitive and just as difficult as it was back in the 50s and 60s. Even, it's just the way that you strategize is totally different.
For sure. And of course, it's changed a lot with technology to a point as well. How many people would you say it took back when you were racing, on a day of racing between your crew, your management, kind of like that? How many people did it take on race day from the pits, would you say, back then to everything? Would you say probably around 20 people?
Yeah, it was, well, it all depended, that's one of the things that has changed with technology is it's added people to the car. Okay. So my team was approximately 40 to 50 people that would run my one car race team. Okay, because you had PR, marketing, you had the engineer, you had the crew chief, you had all of that kind of stuff. And so today, they've got those same people plus more, which is the computer, the data, all that kind of stuff has come into play. The race cars today, they have live telemetry, okay, which is radioing back to the pits what the engine vitals are, what temperatures everything's running, all that kind of stuff. Well, you need a 1, 2, 3 guys to keep an eye on that, okay, to make sure that everything's operating good. Where when I first started, there was no telemetry at all. You were just out there running, okay, and it was up to me to see what the engine temps were and all that kind of stuff.
Interesting. Where do you kind of see, actually, before we get to that point, what was your favorite track to compete at?
The Indy 500.
Okay,
Sure.
I always got to ask that question because, yeah, when I had Daly on a couple weeks ago, he had mentioned he, of course, did a lot of Formula One before and Formula Two, so he had quite some stories to share about Le Mans and stuff like that. But okay, I think that's also the right answer around here, so I appreciate that. Um, where do you see racing going in the future? Do you see it potentially? Do you see maybe even? Do you see the age lowering to 16, possibly?
Not in Indy cars. There's a certain amount of experience that you just have to have in order to be safe out on the racetrack at going those speeds. Okay, so they're racing at 225, 230 miles an hour. You have to have some experience in order to do that. And so no, I think the minimum age is going to be 18, and it's going to be 18 for a long time in the future. So yeah.
Interesting. I think kind of the last couple other questions I have are, other than automobile racing, and you've raced a lot of different things, not just IndyCar, of course. But what would you say your favorite type of racing would be then, besides automobile racing, if you had to pick one?
Oh gosh, I loved motocross. Okay,
Okay, let's
when
go.
I was young, I loved motocross. I loved getting out on the snowmobile and racing the snowmobile quite a lot, and so yeah. But racing in general, just racing. I just the one thing after all the different forms of racing that I've done, there's simple basics that follow no matter where it's at, and that's you have to have the desire to win. You have to have the will to sacrifice whatever it takes in order to make yourself a better driver, and so on, and so other than that, it's just the equipment that you're racing and the drivers' names. Those are the only things that are different.
For sure. Do you think if right now there's a snowmobile race set in Canada and you entered it and there was 70 other folks, do you think you get number one in that race?
No, I am too old.
Hey, I gotta ask the
Hey,
question.
I'll watch, and I'll cheer the guys on. But no, 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 no.
Not
I
that
don't put a helmet
confident.
on anymore.
Interesting. And then kind of the last two questions I have, because I appreciate you coming on. You've done a billion interviews, so this is not your first. This isn't your last. So I appreciate you coming on. A couple
Of
other
course.
questions that I have. What, if anything else, would you change about your career if you had to go back? Of course, I'm in Indianapolis. I'm in New Palestine. I'm going to Purdue. I know kids at in my dorm who want to be race car drivers. So this is a huge area. What would you change looking back on it, perhaps, advice wise?
Um, Gosh, I would. The main thing that I would change um was, gosh, just how I lived life outside of the racetrack. Okay. I would have loved to have spent more time with my family and all that kind of stuff. And so, if anything, that's what I would have done. I wouldn't. There's nothing that I would change it in the racing. I was blessed to be successful at it and all that kind of stuff. And so, it would be outside the car, how I lived my life outside the car.
Interesting. Um, and it's good to realize that. I think, when people always look back on stuff like that I've had on players and singers, and a lot of them, it's always an interesting question to reflect back on, I think. And then kind of the last question I have is, um, and that was, of course, some advice on what you would have done differently, but what advice would you have for the person living in Wichita, Kansas, we'll just say, don't ask me why I said that city, and that person's turning on the TV on a May day. They see the Indy 500. They're 7 or 8. They've gone on a go-kart 2 or 3 times, like most kids. And they say, I want to be a racer. I maybe want to do motocross or something like that and make some money in it. That'd be my dream job. What advice would you have for that specific person?
To don't be afraid to go out and do it. To go out, and if your heart's calling you to go out and race motocross or get into go-kart racing, follow that dream. Go ahead and go for it. It's not out of reach. It's something that, if you dream and apply it and not be afraid to go out and do it, then things will come to you. And so just go out there and just do it. It doesn't matter if it's go-karts, motorcycles, bicycles, no matter what. Go out there and do it.
Appreciate it. And one last question I just want to sneak in is, if you don't mind me asking, what would you say was perhaps your least favorite track to compete at? Maybe because of the tightest turns. There's a couple of those tracks, not just an IndyCar. Maybe what are one or two of those
Yeah, the least
that the
favorites
fans don't really know about? They think
right,
it's
right,
easy.
right. The least favorites were the real ones that were really rough. Okay. So, for example, Cleveland Airport was really rough. Detroit City race was really rough. Toronto is a really rough racetrack. And so it's those racetracks that when you're just bouncing like crazy and bottoming the car out and all that kind of stuff that really I did not enjoy. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, Little Al, thank you so much for coming on the Jacob Buehrer Show. One last thing. Do you enjoy being called Little Al?
Absolutely.
You
It
do?
means I'm
Okay.
young, like
That
I
was another
said.
question. Somebody said, ask if he actually likes being called Little Al,
Yeah,
because
no
maybe he would
worries,
wants to just
Jacob.
be called Al. So
Yeah, no
thank you so
worries.
much for coming on the Jacob Buehrer Show today.
You got it. Thank you.